Hello, today I'm joined by Steve Kaliski. He's a software engineer at Stripe, and we're going to be talking about introducing agentic workflows into your financial tools. Steve, welcome. Can you start by telling us what are agentic workflows and how do they pertain to Stripe?
Sure, and thanks for having me. Um, we can start off with just defining workflow, and then we'll add the agent part, right? Workflow is a series of steps that you want to occur to fulfill some objective, and maybe you have inputs or other kind of context that lead up to that workflow occurring. The agentic part is rather than programming sequential steps or this sort of traditional logic you imagine, you can allow something like an LM or other technologies to help guide the flow and collect context or information from other areas. So as that pertains to things like financial operations, it's basically giving yet another capability to those workflows and allowing those AI systems to execute those operations.
So in a workflow tool, essentially you're able to have very detailed prescription over which step is next and how to branch based on which condition. How do you control that when you've got an agent in the middle, and how do you sort of set the bounds of what each step does for each agentic step?
It's a good question. Part of the desire of the agentic workflow is not deciding, right? So you could have a complex business problem, or you could have many different pieces of data or tools that you can use, and you don't know how to inherently piece them together. Or maybe you want the flexibility of having them pieced together in a variety of ways so that the set of workflows that can be achieved is greater. So we can imagine a simple case. I have a gigantic basket of invoice PDFs, or so imagine a huge box, and I scan them all in. I could build a workflow today where I scan them all in. I do a for loop. I go one by one, some heuristic of something on it. I say, okay, this one's not paid. This one is paid. I need to collect money. I could go through that whole thing. Alternatively, I could say my objective is to get money for all the invoices that haven't been paid. And I will give an agent tools like how to scan in a PDF, how to do the OCR, and how to request funds from a customer. And I can say, figure it out. That is the benefit, right? Because some PDFs may look different, some may have been paid, may not have been paid. There can be different circumstances about different customers. And by just providing the tools and allowing it to guide itself, I can have possibly better outcomes. But of course, that could go wrong, right? So you can build basically functions around that constrain the actions it takes, allow a human in the loop to double check something, whatever it might be.
Okay, so how can you put guardrails around, safely allowing the agent to do certain things or not, or knowing how to recover from when it's done something incorrect?
Sure. So one of the fundamental building blocks in these systems is something called a tool, which is basically traditional programming. Right? The LM has decided that it wants to invoke a function, and that function is going to be the thing that actually does an action in the real world. So imagine the case where we want to invoice a customer and request funds. By the nature of the business we're operating, we might know that we're never going to request $1 million, right? And we're probably never going to request a penny. So you can build programmatic controls around that particular tool that's sending an invoice or requesting funds to check within some constraint. And if it were to exceed the constraint, a human needs to check in and approve before it is fulfilled. But critically, that tool being called is sort of regular code, and the same sort of permission modeling and systems that you'd expect to be around it can be present.
So how do you decide how much of within an individual step, how much an agent should do within one step versus breaking that out into multiple other steps?
Sure, that's a really good question. And I think a lot of it comes down to something referred to as evals, right? Where basically, when I'm writing, imagine the traditional workflow case where I'm going to write unit tests, right? I can describe every possible scenario. I can attempt to describe most scenarios. I can write code around it and make sure that, okay, this thing got called and that got called, and all the mocking that you would expect. In this case, because we've leaned into some non-determinism, because we found that flexible, what a lot of people are doing is basically building evaluations where I can describe what I think is going to happen, and have in some sort of test mode or simulated environment actually allow the LM to take the actions that it wants to. And I can check against that it did hit all these steps. And if it didn't, I can tweak the prompting, or I can tweak some of the controls. I can split up into multiple steps. Like, I can do all that sort of noodling and configuring based off of the performance of the evals.
So you do that in the sort of development stage, and you assess the performance of the task that you've given it, and then based on that performance, you decide to break it up or not, or add more to it.
Exactly. And people talk a lot about prompt engineering, or these kinds of like little tunings or tweakings. It's effectively that, right? Where rather than writing a with traditional code and writing a test and seeing it fail and then fixing the code, you may see the eval performance decrease. And now, instead of writing code, maybe I'm tweaking the prompt, right? Or maybe I'm tweaking how I'm presenting individual tools to the agent, or how many agents there are, to see that eval score go back up.
It's interesting. I'd like to see because it's so vast, isn't it? The possibility. So it must be hard to find best practices on something that's applicable to any type of application.
Yeah.
Let's talk a bit about the Stripe Agent Toolkit.
Sure.
What is the Stripe Agent Toolkit, first of all?
Yeah. So the Stripe Agent Toolkit is a additive framework to the existing Stripe Server SDKs that makes it incredibly easy to integrate Stripe into many of the popular AI frameworks, like Vercel's AI SDK, OpenAI's Agent SDK, LangChain, CrewAI, and also MCP. So if you're building agents or building agentic workflows in those kinds of frameworks, with just a couple lines of code, you can add Stripe.
And can you give me some examples of some simple use cases that you've heard people building already?
Yeah, sure. So, imagine I'm building a chat interface for my store, and a customer comes along and maybe is talking about the products I have, right? So it has access to the Stripe Product and Prices API. It can maybe ask for a suggestion of what to buy, and then ultimately it could deliver a payment link that the customer could then use to actually execute the purchase. So most of the Stripe objects that are common, you can allow your agent to modify or provision.
Okay. And so this new kind of buzz terminology I'm hearing, the latest whenever this video goes out, is MCP, right? Model Context Protocol. Can you speak a bit to what is MCP, and how does that help you integrate with Stripe and with the Agentic Toolkit?
Yeah, sure. So most of the AI APIs like OpenAI and Anthropic have a notion of something called function calling. And function calling is basically a function that the LM can ask to invoke in order to fulfill its objective. So we'll go with a simple example. What's the weather? Right. The LM itself doesn't know the weather, right? It may know past weather, but it can't tell you the current weather. And you could provide a function, get weather, zip code as the argument, returns back a number of what the weather is, and the LM could ask the application to run get weather. It could see that the parameter of zip code isn't present, so it could ask you for the zip code. It would run a regular API caller function to get the weather, return it back. At its core, any of those functions has a description, right? So this is the thing it does, a name, a unique name to refer to it, and the parameters it takes as an argument. MCP is a standard, is roughly a standard of those three things. So it's a way for servers and applications like Stripe to express the functionality that it has in that particular specification, such that any client that chooses to implement it can now make function calls.
So it's like the old school, like a YAML file that describes what your function is doing.
Yeah, sure. And it allows one to abstract how the actual function is called away from the implementer, right? So Stripe's MCP server can be built the way we choose for it to be built. We just expose the set of method definitions, and then the client can tell us which one to execute.
Okay. So where do you set the security parameters and the bounds of what your agent is allowed to do within your Stripe account?
Yeah. So the answer is not much different than any Stripe integration, right?
Right.
So we have Stripe secret keys, but also restricted access keys, where you can constrain the set of functionality available in that authorization context. We of course have test mode and sandboxes where you can in a not sort of simulate circumstances without impacting the real world. And then when you actually import the agent toolkit or set up the MCP server, you can specify the subset of tools that you want available. And that's both for control, right? Maybe my workflow I'm building shouldn't be able to create a payment link, but should be able to get invoice data. But it's also to increase the determinism of what's happening, right? So Stripe is a massive API, hundreds and hundreds of endpoints, very rich request bodies and response bodies. And if you presented the totality of that API, plus you have to imagine other third parties that you might be integrating into your workflow, it could be challenging for the agent or the application to decide which tool to call, right? If I said, hey, here's the workflow I want you to build. Here's 5,000 APIs.
There's lots of different ways of doing the same thing.
And you could reasonably end up calling the wrong one. So again, to increase that determinism, you want to equip with just the appropriate set of tools.
So it's like a restricted access key that you can provide to your
So we
agent.
we both suggest the off layer restriction of what could actually be permitted to be run, but also only revealing the set of tools that you want to have run as well.
Okay, it's like 2 layers almost. And so there's no way you could, or a bad actor could kind of prompt around that, like trick the agent into doing something that it didn't know it could do, kind of thing.
I mean, there's always like the room for a hallucination where you endlessly prompt, you have this tool, you have this tool, you have this tool, and then it fails. But ultimately, it wouldn't be able to call anything because it doesn't actually have the ability to invoke that.
So at the point at which it's attempting, it would just not work, right? It's like, okay, I see. Can you speak to some of the benefits that you've seen customers using the Agentic SDK? Like, what kind of things are people doing with it?
Yeah, I think ultimately people are going to see the utility of these agents in how they impact the world around you or the systems that you're working with, right? So obviously we've all used these applications to help us write text or summarize text or those kinds of things. But when something actually changes in your environment because of that, it becomes even more obviously powerful. So imagine a customer support case, which we see a lot. I have an email that comes in. I need to figure out what payment it's related to. I may or may not refund it. Maybe they have a question about the product. If you can automate that away, right, you've solved a real problem for a customer. You've given yourself time back for other things, all by just giving access to your Stripe integration in that context. Or we have this really great example of this developer who built a application where you can sort of chat with a coffee expert, and then the coffee expert can recommend coffees to buy and then actually buy them, right? And then the coffee shows up at your door, right? So like you see a real world, like a real thing, an atom has been moved because of this. So I'm really excited to see more things like that.
So you have this concept of workflows that are reaching out beyond just returning and retrieving information, actually performing actions. And so what I understand is that the Stripe Agentic SDK is the money movement part of these workflows.
Yeah, so all the tools that are, many of the tools that Stripe has available today that are already used to power all kinds of integrations can now be available here, so that you can sort of move, have money movement capabilities, manage your product inventory, help you earn money, help you run your business, all that kind of stuff.
Are there any limitations on what you can do with it?
Yeah, so obviously there are hundreds and hundreds of Stripe APIs, and we are, still in an earlier phase of learning what customers want to build and what tools should be available. And part of that, again, is driven by like the determinism of these systems, right? If we put the whole API in, we'd have a radically different performance experience than if we just put in a subset. So we're starting off with the things that we know users of Stripe are leveraging the most or make most sense in this context, and continue to add more over time.
So what about things like failure management and retry mechanisms? How does that work with the SDK?
Yeah, sure. So again, all this is still backed by the Stripe API and its reliability and its uptime. So the failure model in terms of like actual API functions and activity is similar. One of the great things here, if you imagine a failure being not about the actual execution, but about the collection of parameters. You imagine existing integration where, oh, I forgot to put in the shipping address, right? And it just fails because it's not there. The workflows can work to request the additional parameters that were not there when the request had to be made, right? So it actually is self-healing for that kind of error profile where, the shipping address is invalid. The error comes back shipping address invalid. Okay, well, I should ask the customer again for a correct one, and then I can retry the request again now that I have the appropriate data.
So would you have to catch that error in your workflow, or does the agent handle that within
these frameworks tend to catch it itself, right? So it can both catch it at, when you just describe the set of parameters that are required or optional in a request. If a required one is missing, it can ask for it before it actually executes the request. And then if the request fails, it can interpret the response of the failure to attempt to self-heal. So, it may say that a certain string input, for example, is required and it's provided, but when it's executing the API, it's the wrong string field. So now I can return that error back to the user. The user can identify the appropriate thing to put back in, attempt the request again.
But the layer before the user is whatever's running, orchestrating this workflow, right?
Yeah.
I see. It's really interesting to me where the line between what the agent does and what the workflow orchestrating the agent is, right? And how I guess it comes with experience, what you orchestrate and what you hand over to the agent.
Sure.
Is there any best practices that you're already aware of or that you can give users on how to handle that?
Yeah, I think in cases where it is obvious certain workflows are going to be continually repeated, those tend to be best to just write with normal code.
Right.
Right. And if anything, you're sort of earlier on discovering what the common patterns are, and that non-determinism is useful. But if you found concrete, consistent, it's always going to do X, Y, Z, you can collapse that set of tools into one, right? So that when that series of tasks is identified as something you want to run, it can run sequentially in the sort of traditional way. That's the best bet we've seen. There's also a lot of interesting sort of multi-agent frameworks that have been emerging,
right,
where you are tuning and prompting individual agents with different tools, maybe different models, different things like that, and then orchestrating amongst those, handing off tasks to one another. So I think that's super interesting too, but still very early.
It reminds me of the previous challenges of sort of divvying up monoliths into microservices, and then deciding, I guess the next evolution is like Lambda functions, how big should they be, how small should they be, and it feels like an evolution of that, right? Like how much do you hand over to the agent versus
and you have cost and resource implications too, right? In the microservice model, theoretically you have a cost efficiency because you might need different hardware, or you may use a different language or whatever it might be for different tasks. You scale in varying amounts.
Or use serverless, for example.
Yeah, and I think the same thing applies here, where maybe one agent or one set of the workflow needs a stronger reasoning model, but then another one which is just doing maybe some summarization, or the tool execution can use more of a performant model. So rather than throwing all the activity behind a high cost model, you can distribute the cost a little better.
So speaking of cost, I know Stripe has usage-based billing, easy for you to say. How can you integrate that with your agentic workflows?
Yeah, so we're seeing two models emerge, and I think things are obviously going to change over time. But the first is outcome-based pricing, and the second is more the usage token-based pricing. So the two examples are, I have a discrete task that this particular workflow is going to do, or this particular agent is going to do. And no matter the time or cost, it's going to be $1 to do. The token-based one is, regardless of the task, I'm going to consume tokens as I'm parsing through documents. Maybe the input is more variable, so a 100-page PDF versus a single-page PDF has different monetary cost. In both cases, as you are churning through tokens or as you complete tasks, you can emit events with usage-based billing that apply to a subscription a customer already has. So as they use your product, they ultimately get billed for it. And to make that really easy, we've again integrated with a lot of the popular frameworks in the middleware that they make available. So for example, with Vercel's AI SDK, we have a middleware that listens to token input and output token consumption, and you can indicate what billing event to fire as those tokens get used. So within the Stripe dashboard then, when you configure these meters and associated prices, you can say, 1 million tokens or 1,000 tokens processed is going to be this number of cents. And then Stripe will do all the work to aggregate that, generate the invoice, charge the customer. Similarly, with the outcome-based one, you could say the act of parsing through one PDF, or the act of maybe helping support one customer support flow is $1. That can also be an event that's emitted and again traced back.
So you can configure UBB to charge the customer that's using your workflow and your agentic piece based on how much consumption or how many tokens they're using on their LLM.
Yep. So you could decide. It all depends on your business model and how you're viewing things. I think in some cases we've seen the use, like the real token usage, as being the cost to the business. Right. And maybe they want 5%, 10% charge on that. The alternative is the customer's looking for an action to be fulfilled, and they're willing to pay some amount for that. And then again, it's up to the business to figure out how to efficiently do that and what the
make that transparent and so on.
But what's great is, like, in the middleware of these frameworks, or in the callbacks of an agent being done, you can automatically have the event emitted there. So you don't have to add a bunch of new billing code or anything. You can just sort of annotate a couple lines.
That's awesome. Okay, where should people go to learn more about how to build with this Agentic toolkit?
Yeah, sure. So if you go to docs.stripe.com/agents, we have a bunch of great docs there, both about the agent SDK, but just generally how we're thinking about integrating Stripe into these flows. There's also great docs about how to use Stripe within VS Code, and a lot of the great sort of LM tooling that we're building to make it easier to build the Stripe integration itself. And then that links out to the GitHub, where you can actually download it and try out the SDK.
Great. Steve, thanks so much for coming in. I'm interested to see your talk later on, and I'll make sure we put that on our YouTube channel as well.
Awesome.
But for now, thanks very much.
Thanks.